mystery, murder, and magic, and here's your host, Andrea.
Hey y'all, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to talk a minute about something very interesting that's going on here in South Carolina at the moment. On January the 3rd, just over a week ago, over in Norway, which is in the Orangeburg area, a group of friends were out riding four-wheelers and decided to explore an abandoned home because they had heard it was haunted. Sounds like a good idea, right? On the back porch of the home was a deep freezer, and an 18-year-old that was in the group decided to open it. He told the authorities that the smell of rotten meat hit him, and he saw what appeared to be a dead body wearing only blue jeans and socks. Now, first of all, when that smell hit my nose, I probably would have just closed it and not even had seen what was in the freezer. I can't even imagine the feeling of opening a freezer and finding a body. And I can't get the thought of the smell of rotten meat. That probably would have just made me slam it shut. Well, fast forward 2 days from that, and that same house burned to the ground. The fire's under investigation, but it's considered suspicious. And as of right now, I don't believe they've determined what caused the fire. Now, it was my mom that originally told me about the people discovering the body in the freezer. And when she and I were talking about it, I told her that the people who were exploring that home were lucky to have gotten out alive because it sounds like the beginning of a horror movie. And now that house is burned down, so that proves something fishy is going on there. And someone still visits that property and obviously has something to hide. I even remember saying something like, I wonder how many more bodies they'll find when I was talking to my mom about it. And it kind of reminds me of when we talked about Belle Gunness's fires and murders from last week's episode. I plan to, as I learn more, or when more information is released, I'll update this situation on future episodes. But anyway, that conversation, particularly the part about the beginning of a horror story that I mentioned to my mom, inspired this week's episode. There's a lot of horror movies inspired by actual events. A lot of those movies are well known, like the Amityville Horror, The Conjuring, The Haunting in Connecticut, My Friend Dahmer, and a lot more. But there's some that's not as well known, and those are what I'm going to talk about today and the events that inspired them. So, the first one on my list is Albino Farm. It's a 2009 film written and directed by Joe Anderson and Sean McEwen, and it stars the famous wrestling star Chris Jericho. It's loosed basically on a legend of Spring Lawn Farm about some college students who went exploring the Ozark Mountains and never returned. The farm itself predates the Civil War and has been owned by a couple of families, including the Headleys and the Sheedys. It's located on North Spring Lawn Avenue, or it was located on North Spring Lawn Avenue in Springfield, Missouri. Several legends of what happened there at the farm have been circulating for years. One legend says that the tract of land was a home to an all-albino family. Another legend says that an albino caretaker lived on the farm property, watching over his sisters who had never married and still lived on the farm to tend it. Now, the craziest legend that surrounds this farm is that somewhere located on the property was an underground hospital where a psycho doctor performed experiments on albinos. One of these legends goes on to say that a murder at a nearby bridge was carried out by a deranged albino man who had become protective of the family who owned the farm. Now, the story goes that a couple out on a date stopped on the bridge when the car they were in stalled. Before the boyfriend left the car to find help, he made his girlfriend promise that no matter what, she kept the doors locked and opened them for no one. Shortly after the boyfriend left, she heard a thump on the top of the car's roof, but she stayed true to her word and kept the doors locked. The next morning when the police arrived, it took them a while to convince the girl to open the doors, and when she finally did, they told her not to look around and escorted her away from the scene. What they didn't want her to see was her boyfriend hanging from a limb just above the car. It was believed that the albino caretaker was responsible for his demise. The building and the properties, or the farm and the buildings on the property, were destroyed in a fire in 1980 and were never rebuilt. But back in its heyday, the property was a popular recreation and vacation spot. Now, the movie itself is about 4 college students who are working on a history research project about backwood American customs. Now, as they're driving along a country road, they almost hit someone with their car. At first, they think that it was like a small boy scraping roadkill off the road, but they're surprised to find it was a dwarf with a menacing appearance. After checking on him, they return to their car and find it has a flat tire, but they keep driving until they find a gas station that is ran by a sight-impaired man. They talk to him for a bit and find that he seems a little bit off or maybe eccentric. They buy a tire and are soon on their way again. Now their next stop is at a white tent in a field. 2 of the students go to investigate it and talk to a person there who has a cleft palate. He tells them about the Albino Farm and hints that it may just be a legend. In the white tent, a revival is taking place, and the man insists that the college students attend because they need salvation. But they turn down his invitation and continue driving until they find a diner to stop for a quick meal. The 2 guys in our story are immediately smitten by a hot waitress until they notice that her hands are deformed and her fingers look like claws. They split up from this point, and 2 of them go looking for the Albino Farm, while the other 2 stay behind and talk to an elderly lady inside of a church who tries unsuccessfully to convince them that there is no such thing as this Albino Farm. The 2 that have left to find the farm stop and ask a boy for directions to this farm, but this boy only communicates by writing on a chalkboard. And so he tells them to ask some teens, and this is where Levi, who is played by Chris Jericho, comes in. Levi and his friends, who are hearing impaired, agree to take them to the farm. From there, it takes on that typical teens trapped in hillbilly hell feeling. It's a bit predictable, but it's still worth a watch. If I had to compare it to another movie that you're probably familiar with, it would be the Wrong Turn movies. Now, at this time, I couldn't find it on any of the streaming services, but the DVD is available to purchase on Amazon. Now, another interesting movie loosely based on actual events is the 1974 film Deranged. It's somewhat based on the serial killer Ed Gein and follows Ezra Cobb, who is a middle-aged Midwestern man who begins a string of serial murders and robbing graves after the death of his mother. Now, where this film steers away from Ed Gein is where our character, Ezra, delights in necrophilia. But much like Ed, Ezra's mother has raised him to be a misogynist, which is someone who has a prejudice against women. Ed Gein also inspired many other horror movie characters, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, and Dr. Oliver Thredson from the TV show American Horror Story Asylum, which, by the way, is my all-time favorite season of AHS. So now, who was Ed Gein? Mr. Gein was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His mom, Augusta, was very religious, and so that her kids, Ed and his older brother, Henry, weren't influenced by the ways of the world, she saved her money that she earned from running a grocery store and bought a farm on the outskirts of town. Ed only left the farm to go to school. His time on the farm was spent doing farm chores and being preached to by his mother. She wholeheartedly believed and drilled the fact into her boys' heads that all women, with the exclusion of herself, of course, were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. And that always, makes me think of the Mama Water Boy, girls are the devil. Ed himself had feminine characteristics and was the target for bullies. To further isolate him, his mother scolded him when he tried to make friends. Ed and his brother tried to keep their mother, Augusta, happy, but she was a very hard-to-please woman, and she often abused them. After their father died in 1940, both boys started doing odd jobs to help out with the family's expenses. Ed would often babysit, and he really enjoyed it because he felt that he could relate to children more than adults. And that's probably because he never had a normal childhood. But that's just my thought. His brother Henry started detaching from their mother and started worrying about the attachment Ed still had with Augusta. Henry despised the view of the world that his mother had and started speaking negatively about her around Ed, trying to get him to see that she was harming him. In the May of 1944, a brush fire broke out near their home on the farm, and the two brothers went out to try to put out the fire. The brothers became separated at some point, and as the dark of night closed in, Ed lost sight of Henry. After the fire was put out, Ed told the police that his brother was missing. Ed then led a search party straight to Henry's body. The police had suspicions about Henry's death because where he was found laying had been touched by the fire, and he had bruises on his head. Despite these unsettling circumstances, the police dismissed foul play, and the coroner listed asphyxiation as the cause of death. The next year, Augusta died, leaving Ed on the farm all alone. Ed boarded up the rooms that his mother had used, including the entire upstairs, the downstairs parlor, and the living room. They were left the way his mother had kept them. Shortly after his mother's death, Ed decided he wanted a sex change and began making himself a woman's suit from human flesh so that he could pretend to be a woman. So how did he obtain the skins that he used? Ed's life began a downward spiral after his mother's death. He had hallucinations of his mother telling him to kill certain women in their town. In 1954, he killed tavern owner Mary Hogan, and then in 1957, he killed hardware store owner Bernice Worden. The last receipt that Miss Worden had written in her hardware store before she disappeared had been to Ed Gein, linking him to her murder. When police searched his property, they found Bernice's decapitated body in his shed, hung upside down by ropes at her wrists and a crossbar at her ankles. Her torso was dressed out like that of a deer. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations had taken place after her death. But more than just Bernice's mutilated body had been found when the property was searched. Police found 4 noses, whole human bones and fragments, 9 masks made of human skin, bowls made from human skulls, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, human skin covering several chair seats, Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, skulls on his bedpost, organs in the refrigerator, a pair of lips on the drawstring of a window shade, a belt made from female human nipples, and a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. Wow. When Ed was questioned, he told police that between 1947 and 1952, he made as many as 40 trips to 3 local graveyards at night to exhume recently buried bodies. Ed claims that he was in a trance-like state when he made these visits to the cemeteries, and on about 30 of these occasions, he came out of this trance while he was there.